The whole place was a laughingstock the day Coulter Vance brought Marlo Quinn home as his wife. They said he was crazy. They said she wasn't worthy. They said the Vance ranch was dead, and that woman was just there to bury it faster. But none of them knew that the most despised woman on the frontier was carrying a business mind sharper than anyone who had ever set foot on this land. This is the story of a woman who turned humiliation into an empire. Watch until the end. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has come. The morning Coulter Vance brought his new wife home to Broken Spur Ranch, the temperature sat somewhere around 94 degrees, the kind of heat that made the air above the road shimmer like water that wasn't there. 3 ranch hands stood near the fence line pretending to mend a post. They weren't mending anything. They were watching the wagon come up the long dirt road, and not one of them said a word until the wheels stopped. Then Denny Pruitt, who had worked the Vance land for 11 years and thought himself entitled to an opinion on most things, let out a low whistle through his teeth. "Lord have mercy," he said. Not kindly. Nobody corrected him. Marlo Quinn, Marlo Vance now, though the name still felt strange in her mouth like a stone she hadn't swallowed yet, stepped down from the wagon without waiting for Coulter to help her. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered, with dark hair pinned up against the heat, and a face that didn't apologize for anything. She wore a practical brown dress that had seen better days, and she carried a single traveling bag that she set on the ground beside her with the calm deliberateness of someone who intended to stay. She looked at the house. The house looked back at her the way old neglected things do, silently, without welcome. Coulter climbed down after her. He was 34 years old, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat inconsistently, with sun-darkened skin and the permanent squint of someone who spent too many hours staring into open distance. He had a decent face when it wasn't set with worry, which lately it always was. "Well," he said. "Here it is." "Yes," Marlo said. "I can see that." She picked up her bag and walked toward the front door without being led. Behind her, she heard one of the hands mutter something she was meant to hear. She didn't slow down. He meant. The news that Coulter Vance had gotten himself married spread across Hardin County before sundown that same day. By the following morning, it had reached Caldwell's General Store, both saloons, the county seat, and the Vance family's own dinner table, where his mother, Estelle Vance, received the information with the stillness of a woman who had long suspected her son capable of spectacular error, but had never quite expected this particular variety. "He married the Quinn girl," said Coulter's younger brother Nate, who had ridden over from his own small spread to deliver the news personally, and seemed to be enjoying it more than was strictly necessary. "Marlo Quinn, the big one, from over past the ridgeline." Estelle set down her fork. "I know who Marlo Quinn is, Nathan. She ran her father's trading post after he got sick. Some people say she's got a head for numbers. Other people say, I know what other people say." Estelle folded her napkin with great precision. "What I don't know is what Coulter was thinking." Nate leaned back in his chair. "Probably wasn't thinking. That's my guess." The broader community shared this assessment. The frontier towns of Hardin County were small enough that everyone knew each other's business and large enough that they could afford to be cruel about it without consequence. Marlo Quinn had grown up at the edges of that cruelty. She was 28 years old and had heard every variation of the joke at her expense so many times that they had stopped landing with any real force, the way a bruise stops hurting after you've pressed it enough times. She was a big woman. That was the beginning and middle and end of most people's understanding of her. She was big, and she had worked in a trading post, and she had never married, and now she had married Coulter Vance, which everyone agreed was the strangest development in recent county history. What they did not say, or said only in the quieter registers of private conversation, was that Vance Ranch was failing, had been failing for 2 years. Coulter had inherited 160 acres from his father, along with a respectable cattle operation and a name that still carried some weight in the county. He'd also inherited his father's debts, which were larger than anyone had known, and the drought that had started 18 months ago wasn't helping. The creek that watered the eastern pastures had run to a trickle. 2 seasons of reduced yields had left him behind on loan payments to Harlan Briggs at the county bank. And Briggs was not a patient man. The marriage had been practical, that was the honest word for it, though neither Coulter nor Marlo had used it directly. They'd met through a mutual acquaintance, a cattle broker named Pete Fossey, who did business with both of them. And the first conversation had been about water tables. The second had been about loan structures. The third had been the proposal, which Coulter had delivered with the directness of a man discussing a business arrangement, because that was in part what it was. "I need someone who can run the books and manage operations while I work the land," he'd said. "I need someone who won't run off the moment things get hard, and I'd rather it be a wife than a hired hand for reasons I think are self-evident." Marlowe had looked at him for a long moment. "And what do I get?" "A stake in the land, legal co-ownership, and a chance to build something that isn't going to disappear the moment my father's loans come due." "Your father's loans are your problem." "They will be our problem," Coulter said. "If you say yes." She said yes, not immediately and not without conditions, which she had written out in her own hand and made him read before they filed with the county registrar. But she said yes. What she had not said, because it was not the kind of thing that fit easily into a business arrangement, was that she had spent her entire adult life watching other people dismiss her, and she had grown very tired of it. She wanted land. She wanted something that was hers, or at least half hers, something that couldn't be taken away by the shifting opinions of people who had never looked at her closely enough to see what was actually there. Vance Ranch was barely hanging on, but it was there. And so was she. The first week was an education in what the ranch actually was versus what Coulter believed it to be. He was not a dishonest man. He simply had the common blind spots of someone who had grown up on a piece of land and stopped seeing it clearly. He knew the acreage by feel, knew which pastures held water and which went dry, knew his cattle by temperament, if not always by number. What he did not fully know, what he had not wanted to know, was the precise shape of the financial hole he was standing in. Marlowe found the books on the second day. They were kept in a wooden box under the desk in the small room off the main hall that served as an office, and they were a mess. Not dishonest, just disorganized, with entries scratched out and rewritten, columns that didn't reconcile, costs logged inconsistently, and a year's worth of receipts shoved loose between the ledger pages like leaves pressed in an old Bible. She sat with them for most of 2 days. Coulter came in on the evening of the second day and found her at the desk with 3 separate ledgers open and a sheet of paper covered in her own notation. "You don't have to do that yet," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." He pulled up a chair and sat across from her, which was not something he'd expected to do in his own office, but which felt, in the moment, like the appropriate response to her concentration. "What's the total?" he asked. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That's worse than I thought." "I know it is." "How much worse?" "About 30% worse." She tapped the page. "You've been logging your operating costs against the wrong column. Your actual debt service is higher than you realized, and the margin on your cattle sales has been tighter than your estimates because you were using last year's prices, not this year's." Coulter rubbed the back of his neck. "How long have you been able to read books like that?" "Since I was about 14. My father taught me." She set the pencil down. "We have 6 months before Briggs can call the loan. Maybe 7 if we catch a break somewhere. That's not enough time to turn the whole operation around, but it's enough time to stop the bleeding if we're smart about it. And if we're not smart about it, then we lose the ranch." He looked at her. She looked back. "All right," he said. "What do you need?" What she needed first was to see every acre. She asked Coulter to take her out over the full property on the third morning, which he did, riding out before the worst of the heat settled in. She brought paper and made notes as they went, not the poetic observations of someone admiring landscape, but the hard practical assessments of someone cataloging resources. She noted the condition of the fence lines, the state of the water sources, the quality of the grass, the density of scrub that was crowding out the grazing land on the western end. "This section," she said at the western pasture, pulling her horse up short. "How long has it been like this?" Coulter looked at the half-choked scrubland. 2, 3 years, maybe. The grass died back during the first dry season and the mesquite moved in. We stopped grazing it." "Why didn't you clear it?" "Cost, time, hands." He shrugged. It seemed like a lost cause. Marlowe studied it, The pasture was maybe 40 acres. Under the scrub, you could see the remnant of decent grass where the growth was thinner. The soil hadn't turned to hardpan. It was recoverable. It's not a lost cause, she said. It's a resource you stopped paying attention to. He didn't argue with her. He was learning in these first few days that she said things flatly and meant them exactly as stated, without the softening qualifications he was accustomed to from people delivering assessments of his land. She also asked about the cattle. The current herd was a mixed lot, some decent breeding stock, some animals that should have been sold off seasons ago. She asked about disease history, about which bulls were working, about what the neighboring ranches were running and what they were getting for it. The Delacroix operation, she said. What are they bringing per head? Coulter named a number. And we're bringing? He named a lower number. Why? He hesitated. Their stock is generally considered higher quality. Is it actually higher quality, or does it have a reputation for being higher quality? He thought about it. Some of both. Then we have a reputation problem as much as a cattle problem. She made a note. That's fixable. On the ride back, Coulter asked her something that had been sitting with him since the first day. What made you say yes? He asked. To this, knowing it was... He stopped. Knowing it was a mess, she offered. I was going to say a challenge. She almost smiled. I've been running a trading post for 5 years. Do you know what people do in a trading post? They come in with broken things, and they want you to make them useful again. I know how to look at something other people have given up on and figure out what it's actually worth. She glanced at him sideways. That's what I'm doing here. He wasn't sure if that was flattering or not. He decided it didn't matter. The neighbors noticed her presence within 2 weeks. In a county where ranching operations lived and died by reputation, rainfall, and the price of beef in the markets to the east, news traveled fast and nothing stayed private long. The word on Marlo Vance spread in pieces, assembled from fragments. She'd been seen riding the fence line at dawn. She'd been into Caldwell's and bought supplies with a list that people described as unusually specific. She'd turned away a cattle buyer who'd come offering a low price on some of Vance's older stock, which no one had ever done before. Roy Delacroix heard this last piece of information at the feed store and laughed. Roy was 47 years old, built like a man who had never missed a meal and never intended to. He ran the largest operation in the county, 400 acres, prime water rights, a cattle line that had been producing consistent results for 20 years. He had also been the person most quietly pleased by the Vance family's financial difficulties, because the eastern pastures of Vance Ranch shared a boundary with his own land, and he had been waiting for those acres to come available. He had, in fact, had a conversation with Harlan Briggs at the bank about the likelihood of that happening. Briggs had been cautiously optimistic. Now there was a wife in the picture, a wife who was turning away cattle buyers and making notes on pastures. She won't last, said his ranch foreman, a thin, leathery man named Coot Alderman who had an opinion on everything and was wrong about most of it. She'd better not, Roy said. He was not a man who made threats. He simply identified obstacles and found ways to remove them. Word also reached Estelle Vance, who drove herself over to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week, arriving without invitation and wearing the expression of a woman who had arrived to settle something. Coulter was out working a section of fence. Marlo was in the kitchen, which surprised Estelle, who had expected her to be doing something else. She wasn't sure what. I came to see the house, Estelle said, which was not true. It needs work, Marlo said. Come in. Estelle came in. She walked through the kitchen and the front room with the slow deliberateness of a property inspector, noting the things that were the same and the things that had changed. The desk in the office was rearranged. The books were stacked differently. There was a list on the wall that hadn't been there before, a list of dates and numbers that Estelle studied for a long moment without saying anything. That's the payment schedule, Marlo said from the doorway. For the bank loans. The dates when each payment is due and how much we need to have cleared by then. Estelle turned. You put it on the wall, so neither of us forgets. My son doesn't... Estelle stopped. This is his home. It's our home, Marlo said. Not unkindly, just exactly. A silence settled between them. Estelle was the kind of woman who filled silences on principle, but something about Marlowe's manner made it difficult to find the right angle of attack. She had expected either submission or aggression and gotten neither. "People are talking," Estelle finally said. "People were talking before I got here. They're saying you're trying to run the ranch. I am running the ranch. So is Coulter. That's what a partnership is." Estelle looked at her for a long moment. She was not, at heart, a stupid woman. She could see things when she chose to look at them directly. What she saw in Marlowe Vance was not what she had expected to see, and it unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite name. "The ranch is in a bad way," she said, with less certainty than she'd had a moment ago. "Yes," Marlowe said. "It was. We're working on that." Yeah. The cleared western pasture was the first project. Marlowe contracted 2 extra hands for a week's work. Men from the county who needed the income and weren't particular about the job. She bought the tools herself from a supplier in the next town over after getting a better price than Caldwell's offered, which Caldwell did not appreciate but could not prevent. The work was hard and hot and took 9 days instead of 7. The mesquite came out in root-deep sections that had to be cut and hauled. The soil underneath was dry but workable, and she had already arranged for a modest delivery of improved grass seed from a ranch supply outfit 2 counties east, sourced from a catalog she had sent away for in her first week on the property. Coulter worked alongside the hired men for most of those 9 days. He'd expected to oversee and found himself digging, which he didn't mind. He watched Marlowe move around the edges of the work, not standing apart from it, but not performing the labor either. She was managing, tracking, calculating, making the small adjustments that kept the effort from running sideways. "Where'd you learn to run a crew?" he asked her one evening. "Running a trading post." She wiped dust off her hands. "You get deliveries that are wrong, suppliers who don't show up, customers who want one thing and say another. You learn to keep everything moving or you lose the whole day. This is different from a trading post. The land is different. The people problem is the same." On the 11th day, she walked the cleared pasture from one end to the other with him. The scrub was gone. The soil was turned. The grass seed was down, and the sky, for once, had offered a light rain 2 days prior that gave them a reasonable chance. "It'll take 1 season to establish," she said. "Maybe 2, but we'll have 40 usable acres back. At current stocking rates, that's enough to carry another 15 head through a season." 15 head didn't sound like much. In context, it was the difference between making one of the loan payments or not. Not everyone was pleased by signs of recovery. Coot Alderman made a point of stopping by the Vance property one afternoon under the pretext of returning a borrowed piece of equipment that had actually been sitting in the Delacroix barn for 6 months. He handed the tool to one of the ranch hands, stood in the yard, and looked around with the proprietary air of a man assessing something he expected to own eventually. Marlowe came out of the house. "Coot?" she said. "Mrs. Vance?" He made the title sound like a question. "Something else you needed?" He looked at her the way men of a certain type look at women they've already decided don't count. "Just checking in. Mr. Delacroix wanted to know how things were coming along." "Tell Mr. Delacroix things are coming along fine." "He also wanted me to mention—" Coot paused with the theatrical timing of someone rehearsed in this particular delivery. "That if you folks ever find yourselves needing to make arrangements on the eastern section, he's a fair man. Wouldn't want to see the bank take it when there's a better option." Marlowe looked at him steadily. "Tell Mr. Delacroix that the eastern section isn't available and won't be." "Well, sometimes what we think isn't available turns out to be when circumstances change." "Then he can check back when circumstances change," she said, "which won't be soon." She went back inside. Coot stood in the yard a moment longer, then climbed back on his horse. When he reported back to Roy Delacroix, Roy listened without expression. "She's harder than I thought," Coot said. "Everyone's harder than they look," Roy said, "until they're not." The cattle were the larger problem. The current herd consisted of 63 head of mixed longhorn stock, which was a reasonable number for the land's capacity in a good year, but put real strain on the water situation in a dry one. The quality was inconsistent, some animals in solid shape, others underfed and underlarge, a function of reduced grazing during the drought months and inconsistent supplemental feeding. Marlowe spent a week going through the herd with the senior ranch hand, a weathered man of few words named Garrett Phelps, who had been with the Vance operation since before Coulter's father died. She asked Garrett questions and he answered them, slowly and without elaboration, in the manner of someone who had learned to be careful about sharing information with people he hadn't yet decided to trust. On the fourth day, she asked him about the breeding stock. "The primary bull," she said. "What do you think of him?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. "He's getting old." "How old?" 7, maybe 8. "And his offspring?" Another pause. "Variable. Meaning some good and some not. Meaning you never know what you're going to get." She nodded. "What about the Dawson breeding stock, over in the next county? Have you seen those animals?" Garrett looked at her with a slight shift in his expression. It was the look of someone recalibrating. "Dawson runs a tight line. Good disposition, good weight gain, consistent conformation. If we could get access to one of their bulls for a season, cost money we don't have. There are arrangements that don't require cash up front." She was already thinking through the structure. A breeding agreement, service fee payable from the proceeds of the resulting cattle sales. It was not a novel idea. She had seen similar arrangements referenced in one of the trade publications she'd sent away for. But it required convincing Dawson that the resulting calves would be worth enough to justify the deferred payment, which brought her back to the quality of the land, which brought her back to the grass. The connections, she was finding, ran through everything. You couldn't fix one thing in isolation, you had to see it whole. Coulter noticed things changing around him with a feeling he couldn't quite classify. It wasn't discomfort exactly. It was more like the slight dislocation of waking up in a room that has been rearranged while you slept. Everything still recognizably itself, but nothing quite where you had expected it to be. He had grown up with the ranch as a fixed thing, defined by its limits as much as its possibilities. He knew the bad fence line on the north side and had long since stopped thinking about fixing it. He knew the old equipment shed leaned at an angle and had gotten used to the angle. He knew which hands were dependable and which weren't and had accommodated himself to both without much examination. Marlowe did not accommodate herself to things. She looked at them and decided whether they were acceptable. The fence line on the north side got repaired in the 5th week. Not replaced, which they couldn't afford, but reinforced with materials she'd negotiated at a reduced rate by agreeing to pay a supplier's delivery invoice that he'd been unable to collect from another customer. The equipment shed didn't get fixed. It wasn't critical enough to prioritize. She knew when to let something wait. What she didn't let wait was the relationship with the cattle buyers. She wrote letters, actual written letters, which Coulter found formal and slightly odd, to 3 different buyers in the eastern markets, introducing herself and the Vance operation and requesting meetings to discuss the coming season's sales. The letters were specific. They described the land, the herd, the breeding strategy she was implementing, and the projected quality and quantity of animals available. They were not boastful. They were precise. 2 buyers wrote back. One of them, a man named Abner Kirsch, who ran a buying operation out of a town 2 days' ride east, agreed to come out and assess the operation within the month. "You think he'll actually come?" Coulter asked when she told him. "He said he would." Buyers say a lot of things. This one means it. She folded the letter. His operation has been losing ground to a competitor who's been sourcing from the Delacroix line. He needs an alternative that can offer volume and quality at better terms. "How do you know about his competitor?" She looked at him. "I asked around." He stared at her for a moment. "How long have you been asking around?" "Since the 2nd week." He thought. The humiliation came, as it always did, from an unexpected direction. It was at the county's informal cattle association meeting in the 6th week, a monthly gathering at the back room of the saloon in Millhaven, the county seat, where the major ranching interests met to share information, complain about weather and prices, and establish the social hierarchies that governed much of the county's actual business. Coulter had been attending these meetings for years, increasingly as a man whose standing was understood to be declining. Marlowe came with him for the first time, which produced a visible ripple in the room when they walked in. Roy Delacroix was there, settled into his usual chair near the front like a man who had decided long ago where he belonged and never found reason to question it. Coot Alderman stood at his elbow. Several other ranch owners occupied the remaining seats, including the Hensley brothers, who ran a mid-sized operation to the south and took most of their social cues from Roy. Marlowe was the only woman in the room. She did not make anything of this. She simply took a seat, pulled out a small notebook, and sat with the manner of someone who expected to take notes and expected those notes to be useful. The meeting covered rainfall projections, a discussion of a road repair petition to the county commission, and the upcoming fall market dates. Then Roy Delacroix introduced a discussion item about water usage along the Shared Creek tributary that ran through 3 properties, including the eastern section of Vance Ranch. "There's been a proposal," Roy said, "from the county water assessor about establishing formal allocation rights along the tributary. I think we should get ahead of that and establish an informal agreement among the affected parties." He meant to take more than his share. Everyone in the room understood this, though nobody said it directly. Coulter was about to speak when Marlowe said, "What proportion is Mr. Delacroix proposing?" Roy looked at her with the measured patience of a man explaining something to someone he found slightly incomprehensible. "This is a discussion between the ranching operations, Mrs. Vance. I'm part of a ranching operation. Coulter represents the Vance interest. Coulter and I represent the Vance interest jointly. We're co-owners of record." She held his gaze. "What proportion are you proposing?" A brief silence. Roy named a number. Marlowe opened her notebook and wrote it down. "And what's the current proportional usage based on the assessor's preliminary figures?" Roy paused. He hadn't expected the preliminary figures to be referenced. "I don't have those with me." "I do." She had sent away for them 3 weeks ago, on the theory that water rights would become a pressure point before long. She named the actual current usage proportions, which showed that Roy's proposal would give him considerably more than his current legitimate share, and the Vance property considerably less. The room was quiet. "That's a difference of about 22%, she said, "which would push our eastern pasture below viable grazing capacity for roughly 4 months of the year." She closed the notebook. "We'd need to see the proposal revised before we could agree to it." Roy Delacroix looked at her for a long moment. His expression was not angry. It was the expression of a man recalculating. "The lady's got a head for numbers," said one of the Hensley brothers, and he meant it as a joke, the kind that invites others to laugh along at the subject of it. Nobody laughed. Not because the room had suddenly become respectful of Marlowe, but because Roy Delacroix wasn't laughing, and nobody in that room was going to read a situation differently than Roy did. On the way back to the ranch, Coulter was quiet for a long time. "You'd already pulled the assessor's figures," he said finally. "Yes." "Before the meeting?" "Yes." He absorbed this. "You knew he was going to push the water issue." "I suspected. The tributary allocation is the most valuable piece of leverage he has against us. He was going to use it eventually." She looked out at the flat country passing alongside the wagon road. "I'd rather address it from a position of information than ignorance. He's not going to forget that." "No," she said, "he's not." The Dawson breeding arrangement came through in the 8th week. It required 2 trips and 3 conversations that Marlowe made herself, driving to the Dawson Ranch on the far side of the county with a written proposal that laid out the terms in the precise language she'd developed from studying the trade publications, and a model agreement she'd found referenced in a ranching journal she'd ordered from the East. Dawson was a laconic man named Earl, who had the unhurried quality of someone who had been told too many things over too many years to be impressed by much of anything. He read her proposal twice, asked 2 questions, sat in silence for a while, and then said he'd need to see the pasture condition before committing. She brought him out the following week. He walked the restored western pasture, looked at the herd, spent 30 minutes with Garrett, asking questions about the breeding history. Then he came back to where Marlowe was waiting. "Your grass needs another season," he said. "I know." "The arrangement would need to be structured to account for that." "The terms I proposed account for it. The fee is payable from proceeds on the first-generation offspring, not the current season." He looked at her. "You've thought this through?" "Yes." Another silence. "All right," he said. "I'll send the bull over in 6 weeks." When she told Coulter that evening, He sat for a moment without responding, which was becoming one of his characteristic responses to information she brought him. "Dawson agreed?" he said. He agreed. Earl Dawson, who hasn't lent a bull to another operation in 12 years. He found the terms reasonable. Coulter looked at the wall where the payment schedule hung. He looked at the numbers. He looked at his wife, who was sitting across the table from him with a cup of coffee she had made without asking if he wanted any. She had simply made two, and was watching him with the quiet patience of someone who had already moved on to the next problem and was waiting for him to catch up. "Marlowe," he said. "Yes. I need to tell you something." She waited. "When I proposed this arrangement," he said carefully, "I told you I needed someone who could run the books and manage operations. I don't think I fully understood what I was asking for, or what you were capable of." She considered this. "Is that a complaint?" "No." He shook his head. "It's not." She nodded once and picked up her coffee. Outside, the wind moved through the grass of the restored western pasture, which was beginning, slowly, imperfectly, against the dry odds, to come back. By the end of the third month, the picture had not transformed. The ranch was still in debt. The creek was still running lower than anyone wanted. The loan payment dates on the wall were not abstract. They were real deadlines with real consequences, and some of them were close enough to keep Marlowe awake some nights, lying in the dark doing arithmetic in her head. But the pasture was recovering. The herd quality was improving incrementally. Abner Kirsch had come out, walked the operation, and left with a preliminary agreement for the fall season that offered better per-head rates than Vance Ranch had seen in 3 years. The water allocation fight with Delacroix had been temporarily stalled by the submission of a formal objection to the county water assessor, which Marlowe had filed herself with documentation attached. None of it was finished. None of it was safe. The enemies they'd made were patient men who understood that financial pressure worked slowly and didn't require dramatic action when time was on your side. And there were mornings when Marlowe rode the fence line at first light, before the heat settled in and before anyone else was up, and looked out at the flat, enduring land and felt the full weight of the gap between what the ranch was and what it needed to become. She felt it clearly, without dramatizing it, the way you feel the distance between two places when you are standing at the start of the road. It was long. It was not impossible. She turned her horse back toward the house where the coffee would need to be made and the day's work would need to start, and the numbers on the wall would be waiting to be addressed. She rode back at a steady pace, not hurrying, not slowing down either. The bull arrived on a Tuesday. Earl Dawson sent him over with one of his hands, a quiet young man named Felix who rode alongside the animal's transport with the attentiveness of someone delivering something irreplaceable, which, in a sense, he was. The bull was 3 years old, dark red, deep-chested, with the calm temperament that Dawson's line was known for. Not docile, exactly, but not the kind of animal that looked for reasons to cause trouble. Garrett walked around him twice without saying anything. Then he said, "That's a good animal," which from Garrett was as close to enthusiasm as the man ever got. Marlowe recorded the arrival in the ledger and pinned the breeding agreement to the board in the office alongside the payment schedule. 2 pieces of paper that represented months of work and the first real forward movement the ranch had made in longer than anyone wanted to calculate. Coulter stood in the yard watching the bulls settle into the holding pen and said, "Now we wait." "Now we work," Marlowe said. "Waiting is what happens after." The distinction mattered. The bull was a tool, not a solution. What the next year produced would depend on the condition of the cows, the quality of the pasture, the management of the breeding rotation, and a dozen smaller decisions that would need to be made correctly more often than not. There was no guarantee built into the arrangement. There was only the possibility of a better outcome than the one they were currently heading toward. She had explained this to Coulter more than once. He understood it intellectually, but she had noticed in the months since the marriage that he was a man who needed visible progress, something he could point to: a fence repaired, a pasture cleared, an animal acquired, to maintain his confidence. The invisible work, the arithmetic done at midnight, the letters sent and the replies parsed, and the terms negotiated in language that looked like formality but was actually strategy. That kind of work didn't give him the same footing. She wasn't criticizing him for it. She just knew it about him, the way she was learning the other things. that he drank his coffee too hot and burned his tongue every morning without adjusting, that he was better with the hands when he was tired than when he was fresh, because exhaustion softened the edges of an authority he sometimes held too stiffly, that he had a habit of standing in the doorway of whatever room she was working in, not asking anything, just present, which she had come to understand was his version of checking in. She had not expected to understand him this quickly. She had not expected to find it useful. The first sabotage was subtle enough that they almost missed it. In the 5th week after the bull's arrival, one of the younger hands came to Marlowe and told her that the water trough in the north pasture had gone foul. The cattle were refusing it. He'd assumed it was a natural contamination. Sometimes things died in troughs. Sometimes the water just turned. But when she went out to look, the smell was wrong, too specific, too chemical. She had Garrett pull the trough and examine it. He found residue along the inner rim that he couldn't identify by smell alone, but which had definitely been introduced rather than developed naturally. "Someone put something in it," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been around long enough to know what that meant about who they were dealing with. "You want to tell Coulter?" "I'll tell him tonight. First, I want to know which hands had access to that trough in the last 2 days." They narrowed it to 3 people, all of whom had legitimate reasons to be in that section. None of them, when she spoke to each separately and without accusation, showed the specific kind of evasiveness that indicated guilt. What one of them did mention, almost as an aside, was that he'd seen a rider on the ridge above the north pasture 2 evenings ago. Someone he didn't recognize. Hadn't thought much of it. She thanked him and went back to the office. When she told Coulter that night, he went quiet in the particular way that preceded anger. Not the immediate flare of temper, but the slower kind, the kind that settled in and stayed. "Delacroix," he said. "I don't know that." "Who else?" "I don't know that," she said again, more firmly. "And I'm not going to assume it. Assumptions in a situation like this can make you do things that are harder to undo than a fouled water trough." She folded her hands on the table. "We replaced the trough, we moved the herd out of that section temporarily, and we put someone on the ridge at dawn for the next 2 weeks. That costs us time and a hand. It costs us less than losing cattle." He pushed back from the table and stood. She let him walk it off. He went to the door, stood there a moment looking out at the dark yard, and came back. "All right, Umbad," he said. "There might be more of this," she said, not to frighten him, just to make sure neither of them was surprised when the next thing came. "I know," he said. The next thing came in a different form than either of them expected. It came through the county auction house, where the fall market listings were being compiled. Marlowe had submitted their offering, a detailed accounting of the animals they'd be bringing to market, their weights, their breeding line, the expected quality grade, through the proper channels, using the form she'd obtained and filled out herself. When the preliminary market catalog was published, she obtained a copy and found that the Vance Ranch listing had been placed in a lower quality classification than the documentation warranted. It was a clerical error, technically. That was the word the auction clerk used when she arrived in Millhaven to ask about it. A clerical error. "The documentation I submitted clearly indicates the breeding line and the current condition grades," she said. "The classification that appears in the catalog doesn't match those grades." The clerk was a middle-aged man named Purvis who had been running the catalog for years and did not enjoy having his work questioned, especially by someone he had not expected to be questioning it. Classifications are at the discretion of the auction house assessors. Were the animals assessed in person? Our assessors make determinations based on submitted documentation. Then the documentation supports a higher classification. I have copies. She set them on the desk. She always had copies. Purvis looked at them without picking them up. The catalog has already been set. Then it needs to be reset. She kept her voice level. The classification affects our opening price and the buyers we attract. An incorrect classification costs us money we don't have to lose. He looked at her the way the auction clerk looked at the rancher's wife who had come in to argue about paperwork, which was not a look that suggested he found her compelling. "I'll need to raise it with the assessors." "I'll wait," she said. He blinked. "That could take some time." "I'll wait," she said again. She waited for 2 hours in a chair near the front of the office, working through a sheaf of correspondence she'd brought with her. At the end of 2 hours, the classification was corrected. Not because Purvis had any particular change of heart, but because she had asked to see the assessors directly and had presented her documentation with such precise specificity that there was no bureaucratic mechanism left for declining. On the way back, she stopped at the feed store and bought supplies she needed. The man behind the counter asked, with the cheerful malice of someone passing on a good story, whether she'd heard the joke going around town about the Vance wife who was trying to run a cattle operation. She had heard some version of it, yes. "What's the punchline?" she asked, because she genuinely wanted to know what they were saying. He told her. It was crude and unkind and rested entirely on her size, which most of the jokes did. She listened to it, bought her supplies, and left. In the wagon on the road back, she let herself feel it for exactly the amount of time it took to get out of sight of the town. Then she put it down. She had learned this discipline years ago. Not suppression, not pretending the thing hadn't landed, but setting a limit on how much space she allowed it to occupy. The ranch needed her full attention. The joke needed none of it. Garrett Phelps, by the 4th month, had become something she hadn't planned on, an ally. It hadn't happened through any deliberate effort on either of their parts. It had happened gradually, through the accumulation of small exchanges. Her asking questions he hadn't expected anyone to ask, him answering with more detail than he'd initially intended, both of them arriving at the same conclusions about what the land needed from different directions. He was 61 years old and had worked cattle since he was 14. He knew things about the Vance land that no document recorded, where the soil changed composition, which fence sections were built in which decade, and how that affected their reliability, which of the older cows had bad years and which were consistent producers regardless of conditions. He had kept this knowledge largely to himself for years because nobody had asked for it in a form he could usefully provide. Marlowe asked for it in exactly that form. "The southeast corner," she said one afternoon, looking at her map of the property. "You've never mentioned it." "Nothing to mention. It's been lying fallow." "Why?" He paused. "Old water issue. There's a depression in the ground out there. Collects water in wet years, which is good, but there was a bad season about 12 years back when it flooded and lost a section of fence, and Coulter's father decided the trouble wasn't worth it." "Has it flooded since?" "We've had 2 wet years since. Didn't flood either time, but nobody's gone back to it." She studied the map. The southeast corner was maybe 25 acres. If the flooding risk was manageable, and 2 dry wet seasons suggested it might be, it was another piece of the land that had been abandoned without adequate cause. "Show me," she said. He took her out there the following morning. The land was rough, the grass sparse but not dead. The depression he'd mentioned more of a gentle bowl than a true flood hazard. She walked the perimeter, reading the ground the way she'd been teaching herself to read it, looking at the drainage patterns, the vegetation distribution, the angle of the slope. "It could be brought back," she said. "Could," Garrett agreed. He was non-committal in the way of someone who has been burned by optimism before. "Not this season. We don't have the capacity to run 2 reclamation projects simultaneously." She made a note. "Next season, after the western pasture is fully established." He nodded. Then he said, "You've got a plan that goes out more than 1 season." "I've got a plan that goes out 3 seasons," she said. "After that, it starts getting speculative." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the sparse grass around them. "Coulter's father," he said carefully. "He had plans too when he first took over. Good ones. He stopped. "He got discouraged," she said. "He got beaten down, is what I'd call it. The drought, the prices, the people who were always looking to pick at anything that was already weak." Garrett looked at the land around them. "This place has had a lot of people give up on it." "I don't give up easily," she said. He looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who had watched too many people say things like that and then do the opposite. "No," he said after a moment. "I can see that." The breeding results from the first rotation were starting to show by early spring. The calves that had come in under the Dawson bull were visibly different from the previous generation. Heavier at birth, calmer in temperament, with the confirmation that the Eastern buyers had been looking for. Not all of them, and not dramatically. Nature didn't work in dramatic strokes when you were dealing with cattle, but the proportion of strong calves was higher than anything the Vance herd had produced in years. Garrett walked the calf pens one morning and came back to find Marlowe and told her, with more animation than she'd ever seen from him, that 3 of the new calves in particular were exceptional. She went out to look. She agreed. She took careful notes and updated the ledger. That afternoon she wrote to Abner Kirsch. She described the calf quality in specific terms, the kind of language buyers responded to because it showed the seller understood what the market wanted. She described the projected weights by fall market. She described the trajectory of the herd improvement over the next 2 seasons. Kirsch wrote back within 2 weeks. He was interested. He wanted to know if the Vance operation could commit to volume. She wrote back with numbers she had checked 3 times before committing to them. Yes, they could commit to volume, contingent on conditions remaining within a specific range. The exchange of letters took another 3 weeks. At the end of it, they had a preliminary commitment for fall, not a contract yet, but a stated intention from a buyer with a solid reputation that represented more forward-looking security than the ranch had had in years. When she showed Coulter the final letter, he read it twice. "He's serious," he said. "He's serious. That's—" He set the letter down. He seemed to be searching for the right word and not finding it quickly. "Marlowe, that's the first real buyer interest we've had in 3 years." "I know." "How did you—" I told him the truth about what the herd was becoming, in language he could use to make a decision. She straightened the papers on the desk. Buyers don't want promises. They want information they can trust. He looked at her. He had that look again, the one she'd started noticing more often. Not the look of someone assessing a business partner, but something less defined, something she wasn't sure she had a name for and wasn't ready to examine too closely. "I want to show you something," he said. He took her out to the eastern section that evening, just before the light went. They stood at the boundary line where Vance land met the edge of the Delacroix property, looking across at the bigger, better-watered expanse that Roy Delacroix had spent 20 years cultivating. "My father used to stand here," Coulter said. "When things were bad, he'd look at Delacroix's land and then look at ours, and you could see him." He exhaled. "You could see him do the math." "The wrong kind of math," she said. "What do you mean?" "He was measuring the distance between where he was and where Delacroix was. That's not useful math, it just makes you feel like you're losing." She looked at the Vance land instead of the Delacroix land. "The useful math is the distance between where you are and where you can get to from here. Those are different problems." Coulter was quiet. "Your land is enough," she said. "If it's worked right, it's enough. We don't need to be Delacroix. We need to be functional, profitable, and still here in 3 years. That's the goal." He nodded slowly. "Still here in 3 years. And better than we are now," she said. The second act of sabotage was not subtle at all. In the 6th month, 2 of the new calves turned up injured, not by disease, not by accident in the rough scramble of young animals, but deliberately. One had a cut tendon that would have been impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. The other had been separated from its mother in a way that suggested the fence between their section and the adjacent grazing land had been opened and then closed again. Marlowe stood in the calf pen looking at the injured animals with a coldness in her chest that was not grief exactly, though there was some of that, but something more like the recognition of a threat fully revealing itself. Garrett stood beside her. "This wasn't chance," he said. "No." "What do you want to do?" She thought about it. The obvious response was to go to the county sheriff, but the sheriff in Hardin County was a man named Alt, who had been getting his fence repairs done by Delacroix hands for years, and was unlikely to pursue an investigation with any real energy. "I want to document it," she said. "Photographs if we can get them. Written statements from whoever found the animals and whoever was working near this section. Dates, times, details." She crouched down and looked at the tendon cut with the careful attention of someone building a record. "And I want to put someone on the south fence line at night. That'll stretch us thin." "I know." She stood. "We can't prove it yet, but we will eventually. People who do this kind of thing don't do it once." She looked at Garrett. "The next time they try something, I want us to be ready." Coulter wanted to ride straight to Delacroix's property when she told him. Absolutely not, she said. He's hurting our livestock. We don't know that. She held up a hand at the look on his face. I believe it too. I'm not saying I don't, but I'm saying that going over there with no proof and a head full of anger gives him exactly what he wants. He wants you to do something rash. He wants grounds to claim you're an unstable operator. He wants to look like the reasonable party. Coulter sat down hard in the office chair. So we just take it. We document it. We prepare. We get proof. And when we have it, she met his eyes. We don't just report it to the sheriff. We report it to every cattle buyer, every association member, and the county assessor's office. We make sure the right people know exactly what kind of man Roy Delacroix is. He stared at her. That's a longer game than I have patience for right now. I know it is, she said. Play it anyway. The public humiliation that the county had been half expecting arrived at the spring association meeting. Roy Delacroix had been quiet for a few weeks. Quiet in the way of men who are preparing something rather than men who have given up. He came to the meeting with a proposal, a county-wide quality standards agreement that would establish minimum requirements for cattle brought to market under the Hardin County listing. The stated purpose was to protect the county's collective reputation with Eastern buyers. The actual purpose, as Marlowe understood it within the first 5 minutes of listening to the specifics, was to establish standards that the Vance herd would currently not quite meet. Standards calibrated precisely to the existing limitations of their operation, rather than to any genuine market requirement. Several members of the association received the proposal enthusiastically. It was well presented, with numbers that looked authoritative and arguments that sounded reasonable if you didn't know what was underneath them. Marlowe waited until Roy had finished his presentation before she spoke. The buyer interest in Hardin County cattle, she said, has historically been based on the range of product available, not on a single quality threshold. I have correspondence from 3 active buyers suggesting that what they value is volume and reliability at varied price points, not mandatory uniformity. She laid copies of the relevant letters on the table. She had brought copies because she had known something like this was coming. A minimum standard that excludes lower-tier cattle from the county listing would reduce volume, narrow buyer interest, and likely hurt every smaller operation in this room, not just ours. The room was not silent this time. There were mutterings. Some of them were in agreement with her, which surprised her slightly. Not that she hadn't expected anyone to be on her side, but that the agreement was more audible than she'd anticipated. Roy Delacroix looked at the letters. Then he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not anger. Something more calculating. Mrs. Vance, he said, and his voice was perfectly even. I don't doubt your understanding of correspondence, but running an operation is a different matter from reading letters about one. I've been running an operation for 4 months, she said. I think that qualifies as some experience. A trading post background is what, Mr. Delacroix? She kept her voice exactly level. He didn't finish the sentence. The room felt the gap where his words had been. One of the older members, a rancher named Calloway, who ran a modest operation on the north side of the county and who Marlowe had spoken to briefly at a previous meeting, cleared his throat. The point about buyer volume is a fair one, he said. I'd want to see more data before agreeing to anything that restricts our market listing. The proposal was tabled, not defeated. Roy Delacroix wasn't the kind of man whose proposals got defeated outright, but tabled, which bought time. On the way out of the meeting, a woman Marlowe hadn't spoken to before, the wife of a mid-sized rancher named Birch, touched her arm briefly and said, low and quick, "Good for you." That was all. She didn't wait for a response. By the end of the 6th month, Marlowe had lost 11 pounds, which she noticed only because her dress fit differently. She hadn't been trying to lose weight. She had been working too hard and occasionally forgetting to eat, which was a problem she corrected as efficiently as she corrected other problems when she identified them. She started keeping a piece of bread or dried meat in her pocket during long working days, and that was the end of it. She was not sleeping as much as she needed to. She was doing arithmetic at 2 a.m. more nights than not. She had developed a callus on her right hand from the amount of writing she was doing, and her eyes ached in the evenings from the ledger work. None of this was visible to the outside world, which continued to produce its jokes and its assessments and its low expectations. In Millhaven, the story of the Vance wife was told in varying ways depending on who was telling it, usually reducing her to either a figure of comedy or a novelty. The fat woman running a cattle ranch, which was treated as inherently absurd by people who had never actually watched her work. What the town did not see was what Garrett saw, or what Coulter was slowly beginning to see. A woman who went at a problem from every angle until she found the one that would work, who kept information the way other people kept tools, organized and maintained and immediately accessible, and who had a particular capacity for absorbing setbacks, without dramatizing them, and returning to the work within an hour of being knocked sideways. She was not invulnerable. She had nights when she sat in the office after Coulter was asleep and felt the full loneliness of what she'd taken on, a fight that most people thought she was losing even as she was slowly winning it, in a place where nobody had expected her and where the welcome she'd received had been approximately none. She had come here for practical reasons and found something more complicated, a piece of land she was beginning to care about for its own sake, not just as a vehicle for proving something. That caring was a liability in some ways. It meant the stakes were higher. It meant losing would cost more than she'd originally calculated. She didn't regret it. The breeding rotation completed its second cycle in the 8th month, and the numbers justified everything she had wagered on the Dawson arrangement. The fall calf count was strong. Not perfect. 3 calves had been lost to illness in early summer, which hurt, and 2 others were underweight. But the overall quality was measurably higher than anything the Vance herd had produced in the past 5 years. Abner Kirsch sent a representative out to assess the animals in person, and the representative spent a day walking the herd with Garrett and then met with Marlowe in the office. "The quality is better than we expected," the man said. He was young, careful with his words, clearly chosen for discretion. "Mr. Kirsch is prepared to honor the preliminary terms." "The preliminary terms assume spring pricing," Marlowe said. "The market has shifted since then. I'd want to revisit the per-head rate." He looked at her. Mr. Kirsch was clear about the terms. Mr. Kirsch set those terms based on projected quality at a certain market rate. The quality has come in higher than projected and the market rate has moved. The revision is reasonable. She slid a page across the desk. "These are the current regional pricing references. I'm not asking for more than the market supports." He took the page, read it, took it with him when he left. Kirsch's formal offer came by letter 8 days later. It was not exactly what she'd asked for. It was close enough that she accepted it. When she told Coulter the confirmed number, he sat with it for a moment and then said quietly, "That covers the September payment." "And part of December," she said, "if the auction house prices hold." He looked at the wall, at the schedule, at the numbers that had been haunting both of them for the better part of a year. "We might actually make it through the year." "We might," she agreed. "You don't want to say it out loud." "I never say things out loud until they're done," she said. "Saying it invites the thing that goes wrong." He half smiled at that. It was one of the first genuine smiles she'd seen from him that wasn't attached to relief or irony or exhaustion. "Marlowe," he said. "Coulter. I'm glad you said yes." She thought about what to say to that. She settled on the truth, which was also the simplest thing. "So am I," she said. Outside, the sky was the hard, clear blue of a late summer afternoon, and the cattle were moving in the far pasture, and the land that had been dying when she arrived was still not safe, still not secure, still the subject of someone else's ambitions and the county's ongoing amusement. But it was more alive than it had been. That was measurable. That was real. The next payment date on the wall was 63 days out. She picked up her pencil and went back to work. The letter from Harlan Briggs arrived on a Wednesday morning in October, delivered by a county writer who handed it to Coulter at the gate and didn't wait around. Coulter brought it inside without opening it. He set it on the desk in the office and stood looking at it the way a man looks at something he already knows the contents of and is taking a moment before confirming. Marlowe came in from the yard, saw the envelope, saw his face, and picked it up herself. She read it twice. Then she set it down. The bank was calling the loan, not the scheduled payment, the full balance. Briggs had invoked an acceleration clause buried in the original loan documents, citing deterioration of collateral value and insufficient progress on the repayment schedule. The language was formal and precise and gave them 45 days to either pay the full outstanding amount or surrender the property. Can he do that? Coulter asked. The clause is real. I found it when I went through the original documents in the first week. She had flagged it then, had known it was a risk, had hoped the payments they'd made would be enough to keep Briggs from reaching for it. And you didn't tell me? I told you the loan had risk provisions. I didn't detail every one of them because there were 11, and knowing all 11 at once wasn't useful information at the time. She picked up the letter again. The question now is what we do. Coulter sat down. He had the look of a man who had been bracing for bad news for so long that the actual arrival of it produced something closer to exhaustion than shock. 45 days isn't enough to refinance. No other bank is going to move that fast. No. And we don't have the full balance. No. So, he spread his hands. That's it. That's not it, she said. She said it with a flatness that made him look up. She was still standing, still holding the letter, and there was something in her expression that he'd seen before. Not optimism, which was too soft a word for it, but the particular focused quality of someone who had already begun solving the problem before they'd finished explaining it to you. Marlowe, sit there for a minute and let me think. He sat. She paced, which she almost never did. She was usually still when she was working through something, and he understood that the speed of this problem was pushing against the edges of her usual composure. After several minutes, she stopped. The auction, she said. What auction? Not the county market listing. Something different. She came back to the desk and pulled out paper. A direct market auction. Our animals, our terms, buyers we invite specifically. No auction house cut, no county listing fee, no classification committee deciding what our cattle are worth. She started writing as she talked. We have the Dawson breeding line documented. We have Kirsch's correspondence. We have the quality records from this year's calf crop. We use all of that to build a buyer list, and we run our own sale. Coulter stared at her. In 45 days. In 30 days. We need 15 days at the end for settlement and transfer. Marlowe, nobody runs a private auction in 30 days. You need a venue, you need... I know what you need. She kept writing. I've been reading about it. There was a private dispersal sale run by an operation over in Callaway County 3 years ago. I have the catalog from it. But she had sent away for it months ago as reference material, with no specific plan to use it, simply because it seemed like useful information to have. Coulter was quiet for a moment. You already thought about this. Before the letter. I thought about contingencies. This is a contingency. She looked up. It's a risk. I want to be clear about that. It requires spending money we don't have easily to spare, and if the buyers don't show or the prices come in low, we won't have enough to cover the loan and we'll have wasted 30 days we could have used on something else. What's the something else? She was quiet. Marlowe, what's the alternative? Negotiating a partial sale of the eastern section to service the debt. To Delacroix. They both knew that was the only buyer positioned and ready. Neither of them said his name. Coulter stood up. He walked to the window and stood there looking at the yard, the barn, the pasture beyond it where the cattle moved in the late morning light. He stood there long enough that Marlowe put down her pencil and waited. The auction, he said, without turning around. Yes, we do the auction. It has to be your decision, too. You understand what we're risking. He turned. I understand what we're risking either way. He looked at her. You believe it can work? She thought about it honestly, because he deserved an honest answer. I believe our cattle are good enough. I believe our documentation is strong enough. I believe there are buyers in the eastern markets who want what we have. Whether 30 days is enough time to get those buyers to the same place at the same moment, she paused. I think we can do it. I'm not certain. That's more than I expected you to say. I don't tell you things are certain when they're not. He almost smiled. No, you don't. The next 30 days operated at a pace that made everything prior feel leisurely. Marlowe wrote 14 letters in the first 3 days. To buyers, to cattle brokers, to ranching contacts she had cultivated through correspondence over the past 8 months, to the 2 buyers who had previously expressed interest in the Vance line, and to several regional operators she had identified through the trade publications as active purchasers of quality Longhorn stock. The letters were specific, professional, and included the documentation that made them credible: the breeding records, the weight logs, the quality assessments, and a note from Earl Dawson himself, which she had ridden to his property to obtain in person. Dawson had read her situation summary without expression, then gone inside and come back with a handwritten statement on his own letterhead attesting to the quality of the breeding line and the professionalism of the Vance operations management. He handed it to her without ceremony. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "Come back when this is settled. We should talk about next year's arrangement." She got back in the wagon and drove home with the letter held flat on the seat beside her because she didn't want to risk it folding wrong. The venue was a negotiation that took 4 days and 2 trips to Millhaven. She needed a space large enough to hold the cattle, manageable for a day's auction, and not affiliated with any interest that would undermine the event's independence. The county fairgrounds were available. The fall fair had ended 3 weeks prior and the grounds were sitting empty. But the county facilities manager, a man named Tull, was visibly uncertain about renting to the Vance operation. "We've had the fairgrounds booked for events before," he said, "but nothing quite like a private cattle auction," she said, "which is a legal commerce event, which is exactly what the fairgrounds were built to support." He hemmed, he hawed. He mentioned that there might be competing interest in the dates she was requesting. She asked him to name the competing interest. He couldn't because there wasn't any. She produced the booking fee in advance and put it on his desk, and the paperwork was completed within the hour. Coulter handled the practical preparations at the ranch, the conditioning of the animals, the construction of temporary holding pens at the fairgrounds, the logistics of moving the herd the day before the sale. He worked with a focused quietness that Marlowe had come to recognize as his best operating mode, the version of him that appeared when the situation was serious enough to burn away the anxiety and leave only the work. Garrett organized the hands, pulling in 2 additional men from the county on short-term hire, one of whom, a lean, capable man named Soto, had experience running cattle at formal sales and proved worth twice his daily rate in the efficiency he brought to the handling arrangements. 8 buyers confirmed. Then 10. Then, in the final week before the sale, a 12th, a buyer from a market operation 2 days east that Marlowe had never heard of until his letter arrived, responding to a contact she'd made through a broker referral chain that had taken 4 letters to establish. His letter indicated serious purchasing intent and budget that made her read it twice. 12 buyers, Coulter said when she told him. 12 confirmed. There may be a few who show without confirmation. That happens. That's more than I thought we'd get. It's enough, she said. If the prices hold. If. The words sat between them like a stone neither of them wanted to pick up. Roy Delacroix heard about the auction on the 4th day of preparation. He heard it the same way he heard most things, through the network of small interactions and observations that constituted county intelligence, assembled from the feed store conversation and the fairgrounds booking and the hands talking at the saloon in Millhaven. By the time it reached him, it was fully formed. The Vance operation was running a private auction in 3 weeks, had lined up buyers from outside the county, was putting its full herd on offer to retire the Briggs loan. He sat with this information for a day before he did anything about it. The problem with the auction, from Roy's perspective, was not that it might fail. Auctions failed all the time, even well-prepared ones, and if this one did, the Vance property would be surrendered to the bank within 15 days of the shortfall, at which point it would be available through exactly the kind of distressed sale that Roy had been waiting for. The problem was that it might succeed, and if it succeeded, if Marlowe Vance managed to retire a full accelerated loan balance through a private cattle sale in 30 days, the story that would tell about her and about the ranch would be a different story than the one the county had been telling for the past year. Roy did not want that story told. He spoke to Coot Alderman on the 2nd day. He did not tell Coot what to do exactly. He described the situation and said that it would be a shame if something disrupted the Vance operations preparations at this particular moment. And Coot, who had been working for Roy long enough to understand the distance between what Roy said and what Roy meant, nodded and went to find 2 men who could be trusted to be discreet. The disruption came on the 20th day, 5 days before the auction. Marlowe was at the fairgrounds overseeing the pen construction when one of the ranch hands rode in fast from the property. His name was Denny Pruitt, the same hand who had whistled through his teeth the day she arrived. He had not become her ally exactly, but he had become reliable, which was more useful. "You need to come back," he said. "The south pasture fence is down and the herd scattered." She was on her horse before he finished the sentence. The south pasture fence hadn't just fallen. 3 sections of it had been cut, clean cuts through the wire, the kind that took a tool and intent. The cattle had drifted through the gap into the rough scrubland to the south, where the terrain was broken and the brush was thick enough to make gathering a slow and difficult job. Marlowe stood at the fence line and looked at the cuts. Then she looked at Coulter, who had arrived 30 seconds behind her. "How many head through?" she asked. Garrett, who had already been out assessing, rode back in. 40, maybe 45. The main herd is still in the north section. Whoever did it cut only the south boundary. Only the auction animals. The ones she'd been conditioning for sale. "We have 5 days," she said. "I know." Garrett's voice was flat. He was angry. She could see it in the set of his jaw. But he was the kind of man whose anger expressed itself as effort rather than noise. "Soto and I can take 4 men and start gathering. It'll take 2 days if the terrain cooperates." "The terrain won't cooperate," she said. She knew that brush. She'd ridden it. "Plan for 3. We have 2 to spare." "And if an animal gets hurt in the gather?" She didn't answer that directly because there wasn't a good answer. "Do the best you can." Coulter had been standing at the cut fence, crouched down, looking at the wire ends. He stood up. "I'm going to Delacroix." "No," Marlowe said. "Marlowe, no." She put herself between him and his horse, which was a slightly absurd positioning, and they both knew it, but it made the point. "Listen to me. If you go over there right now and make accusations without proof, he will use it. He will go to Briggs and say the Vance operator is unstable and making threats, and Briggs will use it as grounds to expedite the foreclosure before the auction even happens. Do you understand me?" He was breathing hard. The anger in him was the fast kind, not the settled kind, and it was right at the surface. "Coulter." She waited until he looked at her. "Give me 3 days." "To do what?" "To prove it, and to run the auction anyway." She held his gaze. "We can still do this. The herd isn't gone, it's scattered. Garrett can gather them. The buyers are confirmed. The venue is booked. Nothing is lost yet." He looked at her for a long moment. The anger didn't go away. It just got redirected, turned inward, pressed down into something more disciplined. 3 days, he said. The gather was exactly as hard as Marlowe had predicted. The brush on the south side of the property was a mix of mesquite and cedar that ran in broken channels through rocky ground, and the cattle had gone in every direction without particular intention, simply following the available openings. Gathering them required patience and bodies, pushing slowly through the scrub, reading the terrain, preventing the animals from drifting further south where the ground became truly difficult. Soto proved his value. He had the natural quiet authority with cattle that some men either have or don't, and he organized the gather with a minimum of wasted motion. Garrett worked alongside him without ego, deferring on the tactical decisions and providing the local knowledge of the land that Soto lacked. Marlowe rode with them for the first full day. She was not a skilled enough cattlewoman to be useful in the actual gather, but she was useful on the perimeter, tracking where the animals had gone, communicating between the separate groups working different sections of the brush, making the logistical decisions that kept the effort from running into itself. By nightfall, they had recovered 26 of the scattered animals. 19 remained somewhere in the brush. She rode back to the house at dusk with dust in her hair and a deep ache in her lower back from the hours in the saddle. She ate standing at the kitchen counter because she didn't have the will to sit down, and then she went to the office and looked at the numbers one more time, running the calculation of what minimum per-head prices they needed to cover the loan balance. If they recovered all the scattered animals and the prices held, they were fine. If they recovered 35 of the 40 and the prices held, they were close. If the prices came in low and they recovered only 30, she stopped that line of calculation. It wasn't useful yet. She lit the lamp and wrote to the 3 most committed buyers on her list, brief notes updating them on the preparation status, not mentioning the fence, not suggesting any uncertainty, simply confirming the sale date and enclosing the final herd documentation. Professional. Steady. The version of herself she needed to be on paper regardless of what was happening on the ground. The proof she'd promised Coulter came from an unexpected direction. On the second day of the gather, one of the additional hired hands, a man named Vickers, who had been brought in for the auction preparation and had no particular loyalty to anyone, came to Marlowe and told her, with the discomfort of someone not sure they were doing the right thing, that he had been approached in Millhaven 2 weeks ago by a man he recognized as one of Coot Alderman's regular associates. The man had offered him money to report on the Vance preparation schedule, specifically when the fence line checks would be lightest. Vickers had taken the information and not done anything with it. He was telling her now because the fence had gone down and he'd done the arithmetic. She asked him to write down everything he remembered, the man's description, the location of the approach, the exact nature of what was asked and what was offered. He wrote it out slowly, with the labored handwriting of someone unaccustomed to the task, and gave it to her. She had it witnessed by Garrett and Soto, who signed the bottom of the page. Then she made 2 copies. One copy went into the office file. The second copy she addressed to the county assessor's office, along with a letter describing the pattern of interference, the fouled water trough, the injured calves, the classification manipulation, the fence cutting, and requesting that the matter be examined as a pattern of deliberate commercial interference. She did not accuse Roy Delacroix by name in the letter, but the chain of evidence she assembled pointed in one direction without requiring her to state it directly. She gave the letter to the county writer the morning of the 3rd day. Then she went back to work. The full herd was recovered by the morning of day 4, 1 day before the auction. 38 animals out of 41 had come through the gather without significant injury. 2 had scrapes and 1 cow had a swollen leg that Garrett assessed as bruised rather than broken, which meant she could walk but wouldn't be presented at auction. 37 animals, not the 40 Marlowe had planned for. She reworked the numbers that evening, calculating what 37 head at the expected price range would yield. It was close. It was uncomfortably close. If the bidding came in at the midpoint of her projections, they would cover the loan balance with a margin of roughly $400, which felt like walking a plank over deep water. "Tell me the range again," Coulter said. He was sitting across the desk from her, in the same position he'd taken the first night she'd laid out the loan numbers, 8 months ago. She told him. $400 margin at midpoint, he said. Yes. And if prices come in below midpoint, then we fall short. By how much? She told him that too. It wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't good. Coulter looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "My mother has some capital set aside. Not a lot. I've never asked her for money since I took over the ranch." "How much?" He named a number. "That would cover the shortfall if prices come in 10% below midpoint," Marlowe said. She thought about it. "It would be a loan between family members. I'd want it documented and repaid." She wouldn't. "I'd want it documented," she said again. "Not for her sake, for ours. We don't build something real on informal debts." He looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression that she couldn't quite read. "You'd ask her yourself." "If you want me to." "She doesn't like you." "I know." A beat. "I think she's starting to respect me, which is more useful." He almost laughed. It came out as a rough exhale, which was close enough. "I'll call on her tomorrow morning, before the auction." "What?" The morning of the auction was cold and clear, the kind of October morning that came in with a hard edge and no ambiguity about the season. The fairgrounds opened at first light, and the cattle were moved in through the early hours, Garrett and Soto directing the handling with the efficiency of men who had spent 4 days in a crisis and come out the other side too tired for anything but competence. Buyers arrived through the mid-morning. Some Marlowe recognized from correspondence. Others she didn't. 12 confirmed buyers and 4 additional who had come without notice, which was better than she'd let herself hope for. She stood near the entry with a handwritten list and checked names as they came in, greeting each buyer briefly and directing them to the registration table that Coulter had set up near the pen entrance. She had put on her best dress that morning, which was not a particularly impressive dress, but was clean and pressed and represented a deliberate choice about how to present herself. She did not try to look like something she wasn't. She simply looked like herself, presented carefully. Roy Delacroix was not among the buyers. She had not expected him to be. But Coot Alderman had positioned himself on the road outside the fairgrounds, which she noticed on her third trip between the pens and the entry. He wasn't doing anything, technically. He was simply there. She walked over to him. "Coot," she said. He had the expression of a man who had come to watch something fail. "Mrs. Vance, big day." "It is." She kept her voice pleasant. "I filed a report with the county assessor's office yesterday regarding a pattern of interference with our operation over the past several months. I thought you should know that." She paused. "The documentation is fairly complete." He didn't say anything. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in his eyes did. "You're welcome to stay and watch the sale," she said. "It's a public venue." She walked back inside. The auction itself started at 10 o'clock. Marlowe had contracted a professional auction caller from the next county, a fast-talking man named Birdsell, who had run livestock auctions for 20 years and had a gift for building energy in a room, for making buyers feel that the animal in front of them was the one they needed right now. She had chosen him specifically for this. The first 3 animals went high, not dramatically, but measurably above midpoint. Marlowe stood at the back of the gathered buyers and tracked each bid on her pad, keeping the running total with the mechanical focus she brought to numbers even when her hands weren't entirely steady. The 4th animal, one of the best calves from the Dawson breeding rotation, a young steer with exceptional conformation and the weight to show for good management, sparked a genuine bidding contest between 2 buyers who had been quiet for the first 3 lots. They went back and forth with the focused intensity of men who had decided they wanted the same thing and were going to determine who wanted it more. The gavel came down at a price that was 30% above Marlowe's high projection for that animal. She wrote the number down. She checked it. She wrote it again because she wanted to make sure her hand had not made an error. Coulter appeared at her elbow. He had seen the bid from across the room. "Was that right?" he said quietly. "Yes," she said. He exhaled slowly. "Keep going," he said, not to her exactly, but to the room, to the situation, to whatever combination of effort and circumstance had brought them to this moment. The next animal went to the quiet buyer from the Eastern Market, the one who had arrived by the referral chain, whose budget had made her read his letter twice. He bid with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows what things are worth and is willing to pay for it, and he secured the animal at a price that revised Marlowe's running total upward again. By the 15th lot, they were above midpoint across the board. By the 20th, they were above her high projection on 11 of 20 animals. The room had the specific energy of a sale that has found its own momentum, buyers feeding off each other's engagement, Birdsell reading it perfectly and keeping the pace at exactly the speed that maintained urgency without creating fatigue. Marlowe tracked every bid. Her total climbed. Estelle Vance had come. Marlowe had not known she would. She arrived at noon, walked in without announcement, and took a position near the wall where she could see both the animals and the buyers and her son. She did not speak to Marlowe, but when the bidding on the 22nd lot drove the price past the point where the loan shortfall was covered, past the point where the morning's margin calculation became irrelevant, Estelle looked across the room and met Marlowe's eyes. She gave her a single nod, small, brief. Marlowe turned back to her pad and kept writing. The last animal sold at 4 in the afternoon. Birdsell brought the gavel down on a final lot that had produced one more bidding contest, one more price above projection, and the room settled into the quiet aftermath of something that had run its course. Marlowe added the final number to her total. She added it twice. She sat down on a nearby fence rail because her legs had been holding her up for 8 hours, and they were done with that. Coulter came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "What's the number?" he finally asked. She told him. The loan balance, the bank payment, the margin after. He sat down next to her on the fence rail. They were both dusty and tired, and the fairground smelled of cattle and autumn and the particular combination of effort and relief that doesn't have a proper name. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." "Yes," she said. He put his hand over hers on the fence rail. It was the first time he'd done anything like that. Simple and direct and without prelude. She didn't move her hand. Marlowe, he said, I want to say something and I want to say it correctly. She waited. I propose this marriage as a business arrangement, he said, and you came into it as one. I want you to know that it stopped being just that for me a while ago. I don't know exactly when. He looked at their hands on the fence rail. I thought you should know. She was quiet for a moment, which he had learned by now to recognize as thought and not withdrawal. I know, she said. It stopped being just that for me, too. He looked at her. A while ago, she added. Outside, the sun was dropping toward the flat horizon, and the cattle were settling in the pens, and somewhere across the county, Roy Delacroix was receiving, through whatever channels delivered such things to men like him, the information that the Vance auction had succeeded, that the ranch was not going to be sold, that the woman he had dismissed and harassed and worked against for the better part of a year was still there, still standing, still holding the numbers that made the land work. Marlowe stood up from the fence rail and straightened her dress and picked up her ledger. There were settlement documents to sign, buyers to thank, animals to move back to the property, a payment to arrange with Briggs that she intended to hand-deliver herself, in full, in cash, with a receipt she would keep in the office file for the rest of her life. She had done the arithmetic correctly. She always did the arithmetic correctly. But this time, the numbers had also done something she hadn't quite planned for. They had built something between her and Coulter and the land and the people who worked it that was harder to name than profit and more valuable than anything she had written in a ledger. She walked back into the fairgrounds to finish what she had started. The payment to Harlan Briggs happened on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the auction. Marlowe had insisted on delivering it in person, which Coulter had expected by now and didn't argue with. They rode into Millhaven together, tied their horses in front of the county bank, and walked in through the front door at 9 o'clock in the morning when the light was still coming in low and flat through the east-facing windows. Briggs was in his office. His secretary announced them, and Briggs came out himself, which was either courtesy or curiosity. Marlowe suspected the latter. He was a compact man in his 50s with the careful, uninflected manner of someone who had spent decades making consequential decisions without letting anyone read him while he made them. He shook Coulter's hand and nodded at Marlowe in the way of a man who had not quite decided how to categorize her. "Mr. Vance," he said, "I understand you have a settlement payment." "We do," Marlowe said. She opened the document case she'd carried in and placed on his desk the settlement letter, the payment draft, and a full accounting of the auction proceeds with the buyer names and final prices itemized. Full balance of the accelerated loan plus the accrued interest through today's date. I've included documentation of the auction proceeds, so there's no question about the source of funds. Briggs looked at the documents. He picked up the payment draft and looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man revising a prediction he'd been fairly confident in. "This is complete," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He sat down. He signed the receipt. He stamped the loan documents as satisfied and handed copies across the desk with the smooth, practiced efficiency of someone completing a transaction they'd performed 1,000 times, except that the quality of his silence suggested this particular transaction was not sitting entirely comfortably with him. Coulter took the stamped documents. He didn't say anything. He told Marlowe on the ride in that he didn't trust himself to speak to Briggs without the conversation going somewhere unproductive, and she had said that was probably wise, and he had appreciated that she hadn't tried to talk him out of the feeling, just the action. At the door, Marlowe turned back. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "the acceleration clause in our loan, was invoking it your idea, or were you advised to do it by someone with an interest in the property becoming available?" The silence that followed was approximately 3 seconds long. In a different kind of room, it wouldn't have meant anything. In this room, with this man, it meant exactly what she thought it meant. "Loan decisions are confidential matters," Briggs said. "Of course," she said. "I thought I'd ask." She went out into the morning, and Coulter fell into step beside her. "He was in Delacroix's pocket," Coulter said, once they were clear of the building. "I don't know that for certain." "You know it." She was quiet for a moment. "I know it's likely. I don't have proof." She put the document case under her arm. "But he knows I asked. That's enough for now." The county assessor's report on the interference complaint came back 6 weeks after the auction. It was not a dramatic document. County assessors did not write dramatic documents. It found, in the careful language of official findings, that there was credible evidence of deliberate interference with a commercial operation in the form of property damage and water contamination, and that the evidence suggested organized coordination rather than isolated incidents. It recommended that the findings be referred to the county sheriff for further investigation. Whether the sheriff would pursue it was another question. Alt was the same Alt who had been getting his fence work done by Delacroix hands, and he moved through any investigation involving Roy Delacroix with the energy of a man wading through deep water while wearing heavy boots. But the report was public record, and Marlowe made sure it was read. She sent copies to every member of the County Cattle Association, with a cover letter that described the pattern of events in plain language: the fouled trough, the injured calves, the classification manipulation, the cut fence on the eve of the auction, and referenced the assessor's findings. She did not name Roy Delacroix directly in the letter. She did not have to. The members of the association had been watching the same event she'd been living, and they were perfectly capable of drawing a line from one point to the next. The response was not immediate, and it was not universal. Several members said nothing. The Hensley brothers, who had been Roy's reliable audience for a year, stayed conspicuously quiet. But Calloway, the older rancher from the north side who had spoken up at the spring association meeting, wrote back to say that he appreciated her bringing the matter to light. 2 other operators sent similar notes. Small acknowledgments that, taken together, shifted something in the room's arrangement. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. Roy Delacroix said nothing publicly. He attended the Winter Association meeting and sat in his usual chair and contributed to discussions with his usual authority. But the room felt different around him, and he would have had to be less observant than he was not to notice it. Coot Alderman did not appear at that meeting. Coot had quietly left the Delacroix employ the week after the auction, which the county took as its own kind of statement. The winter was the first season Marlowe spent on the ranch that felt, in some partial and tentative way, like belonging. It was not a warm winter, and it was not an easy one. The creek ran lower than the previous year through January, which put pressure on the water management and required moving the herd twice to optimize access to what was available. The Southeast Corner project, the second reclamation she'd planned, the bowl-shaped section that Garrett had flagged a year earlier, got started in February and went slower than projected because the ground was harder than expected, and one of the contracted hands left for other work halfway through, requiring a replacement who needed time to get up to speed. She did not love difficulty. She had never subscribed to the idea that hardship was inherently character-building. She thought that was mostly something people said to make difficulty seem meaningful in retrospect. But she had learned, over the course of this year, that she trusted herself inside difficulty in a way she hadn't fully known she could. When something went wrong, she didn't freeze and she didn't spiral. She assessed and she moved. It was not courage exactly. It was more like a specific kind of steadiness that she'd been developing since she was old enough to run her father's trading post accounts. What was new was having someone to be steady alongside. She and Coulter had settled into each other in the way that people do when they've been through something together that required more than either of them had expected to give. It was not a fairy tale settling. Nothing about them was that. He still held his authority too stiffly sometimes, still had mornings when the accumulated weight of the past several years showed on his face before coffee, still made decisions occasionally without consulting her that he should have consulted her on, and she still had to correct him on this, which she did without drama, and he accepted without excess pride, most of the time. She was still not easy company. She was too direct for ease, too focused, too apt to bring a problem to the dinner table and lay it out flat between the plates. She knew this. She wasn't going to become a different person. But they had learned each other's rhythms in the way that shared work teaches you about someone more honestly than any other method. He knew when she needed silence and when silence from him meant withdrawal. She knew when his certainty was real and when it was the performance of certainty over genuine doubt, which was a distinction that mattered enormously in the decisions they made together. One evening in December, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp turned low and the wind outside doing what the wind did in December on the plains, She had said to him without particular prelude, "I didn't expect to want to stay." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "When I came here, I expected to work and to fight and to either save the place or not. I didn't expect to care about it the way I do now." She looked at the lamp. "That surprised me." He thought about it for a moment. "Does it change anything?" "It changes why I work as hard as I do, the reasons underneath it." She paused. "I work hard because it's mine now, not just legally, actually." He reached across the table and took her hand, which he did sometimes now with a naturalness that still surprised her slightly when she noticed it. "It's ours," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's what I mean." Estelle Vance came to the ranch for dinner in January. It was the first time she had come for a meal since Marlowe arrived, and both women were aware of this without referring to it. Coulter had issued the invitation, but Marlowe had suggested he do so, which he understood was its own kind of reaching out. Estelle arrived in the late afternoon and sat in the front room while Marlowe finished the preparations, and the quality of the silence between the kitchen and the front room was something that Coulter stayed carefully outside of, finding reasons to be on the porch. Estelle came to the kitchen doorway at some point. "You don't need help," she said. It was not quite a question. "I don't," Marlowe said. "But you can come in if you want to." Estelle came in. She looked at the kitchen, at the orderly arrangement of it, the list of the week's tasks pinned near the door, the ledger sitting open on the side table because Marlowe always had a ledger somewhere nearby. "You run a tight house," Estelle said. "I run a tight operation," Marlowe said. "The house comes with it." A small silence. Estelle picked up the edge of a dish towel and set it down again. "The auction," she said. "I heard the final numbers from Coulter." "Yes." "I had money set aside when you came to see me. I thought I might need to offer it." "You didn't need to in the end." "No." Estelle looked at her. "You didn't need me to." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement that Estelle Vance was capable of producing, and Marlowe received it as such. She didn't make more of it than it was. She put it in its proper place, which was something real, but not sufficient to replace a year's worth of cold regard. Still, it was there. "You should know," Estelle said, a little stiffly, "that when Nate said what he said about this marriage, I agreed with him." "I know you did." "I was wrong." Marlowe looked at her. Estelle was not a woman who said that easily. You could see what it cost. "Thank you," Marlowe said. Just that. Dinner was not warm, and it was not simple. Old patterns don't dissolve in one evening, but it was better than anything the year before had offered, and when Estelle left that night, she shook Marlowe's hand at the door, which she had never done, and said, "Next month, come to me. I'll cook." After she was gone, Coulter said, "She's never invited anyone to dinner she didn't already like." "I know," Marlowe said. She went back inside. Tampo. The spring brought changes that ran faster than Marlowe had projected, which was unusual. She generally projected conservatively enough that reality ran a little behind. The southeast corner came back. Not all at once and not perfectly, but the new grass established itself through March and April in a way that moved the project from the tentative column to the real one, and by May the section was carrying 8 head that would have had no grazing ground otherwise. Small number. Real progress. More significantly, the second breeding rotation under the Dawson arrangement produced a calf crop that was, by every measurable standard, the best the Vance operation had seen in its history. Not by a dramatic margin, by a consistent one, which was more valuable. Consistent quality, season over season, was what built a reputation, and reputation was what made buyers come back. Abner Kirsch came back. He came in person this time, without a representative, which Garrett noted was unusual for a buyer of his volume. He walked the herd with Marlowe on a Tuesday morning in early May, asking questions she answered with the specificity he'd come to expect from her correspondence. And at the end of the walk, he said he wanted to discuss a forward contract. "A what?" Coulter asked, when she brought it back to the office that evening. "A contract for next year's animals, priced today. He locks in a volume and a price. We commit to delivery of cattle meeting the documented quality standards." She sat down. It's common in larger markets, less common here. What's he offering? She named the price. Coulter was quiet. The price was good. It was better than good. It was the kind of stability that the Vance operation had never had, not reacting to the market each year, but knowing a full season ahead what the animals were worth and what the cash flow would look like. What's the catch? He asked. If we can't deliver the volume or the quality, we're liable for the shortfall. She looked at the numbers she'd written. It's a risk in a bad year. It's an enormous advantage in a normal year. Do we think next year will be a normal year? I think we're managing the land well enough now that we can tolerate more variance than we could a year ago. She tapped the page. The western pasture is fully established. The southeast corner is coming on. The breeding line is consistent. We have more resilience than we did. So you think we should take it? I think we should negotiate the quality threshold definition before we sign anything, because the current draft language is vague enough to create disputes. But yes, I think we should take it. He nodded. Then we take it. The negotiation with Kirsch took 10 days of correspondence and one in-person meeting at which Marlowe produced a revised quality threshold clause that she had written herself, referencing language from 2 other forward contracts she'd obtained through the trade network she'd built over the past year. Kirsch's lawyer looked at it, made 2 small changes, and accepted the rest. When the contract was signed, Marlowe put it in the office file, in the drawer that now held, alongside the loan satisfaction documents and the assessor's report and the original breeding agreement with Dawson, a year's worth of evidence that the ranch was a different thing than it had been. She looked at the file for a moment before closing the drawer. She thought about the day she'd arrived, the heat, the hands watching from the fence, Denny Pruitt's low whistle, the ledgers in the wooden box that had been a mess of unreconciled columns and misplaced receipts, the payment schedule she'd put on the wall, which Estelle Vance had looked at with something between insult and shock. The payment schedule was still on the wall. Every date on it had been met. She closed the drawer. And so summer came, and with it the particular satisfaction of work that has compounded. Small decisions made months ago producing visible results now. Investments of time and effort arriving in the form of better grass, heavier cattle, a water management system that was handling the dry months better than it ever had. Garrett asked her one afternoon, while they were checking the fence line along the north section, whether she'd thought about bringing on another permanent hand. The operation's grown enough, he said. One more body would let us develop the southeast section faster and give us coverage on the breeding rotation without stretching Soto so thin. She had thought about it. Who do you have in mind? He named a man, a younger hand named Reese, who had worked a neighboring property and was looking for steadier employment. He's good with cattle, better than good, and he's not the kind who talks too much about the people he works for. That last quality, she understood, was Garrett's way of saying the man was trustworthy. Have him come by next week. I'll talk to him. Reese came by on a Wednesday and sat in the kitchen and talked to Marlowe for 40 minutes while she assessed him the way she assessed everything, directly, without ornamentation, asking exactly what she wanted to know and listening to the answers more carefully than most people would have thought necessary for a ranch hand interview. Coulter sat in on the second half of the conversation and added 3 questions of his own. After Reese left, Coulter said, "Hire him." "I already decided to," she said. "Then why did you wait for me to say it?" "I didn't wait for you to say it. I wanted to know if you saw what I saw." "Which was?" "A man who tells the truth when the easier answer would be something else." She closed her notebook. Garrett knew. That's why he suggested him. Coulter smiled at that. The easy smile that had been appearing more often this past year, the one that didn't have exhaustion behind it. "You and Garrett have your own language." "We speak the same dialect," she said. "Practical." Roy Delacroix's reversal of position arrived in the form of a letter in August. He wrote it himself, in his own hand, which the county would have found remarkable if they'd known, because Roy Delacroix was not a man who wrote his own letters. The letter was formally polite in the way of correspondence that has been considered carefully and revised more than once. It expressed his regard for the Vance operation's recent performance. It referenced the upcoming renewal of the county water allocation process and suggested that a meeting between their 2 operations might be mutually beneficial in approaching the assessor jointly. It noted that well-managed neighboring properties generally produced better outcomes for everyone. Marlowe read it 3 times. He wants to cooperate, Coulter said, reading over her shoulder. He wants to manage the situation, she said. He's realized we're not going anywhere, and he'd rather have us positioned as partners than as adversaries who have a public assessor's report about interference. Is there a difference? The outcome might look similar. The motivation is different. She set the letter on the desk. We can meet with him. We should meet with him. Having a functional relationship with the largest operation in the county is better than an ongoing war. Even after everything he did. She looked at the letter. People do what they think they can get away with. When they realize they can't get away with it anymore, they adjust. That's not the same as rehabilitation. It's just recalculation. She paused. I'm not interested in punishing Roy Delacroix. I'm interested in running a successful operation. If he's calculated that cooperation serves him, then cooperation is what we offer, with clear boundaries and nothing on a handshake. Coulter sat down. You'd sit across a table from him. I'd sit across a table from him, and I'd have a copy of the assessor's report in my document case the whole time. Yes. He looked at her. He had long since stopped being surprised by her, but occasionally something she said still produced a particular kind of stillness in him, an arriving awareness of the specific nature of the person he had married, as though he kept needing to confirm it was real. All right, he said, set the meeting. The meeting happened 2 weeks later at the county assessor's office, which Marlowe had suggested as the venue, and Roy had accepted without comment, understanding what the choice of venue communicated. They sat on the same side of the water allocation table for the first time, which was awkward for the first 20 minutes and functional for the hour after that. Roy Delacroix was careful in his language. He said nothing that acknowledged anything, but he was also genuinely informed about the water situation and what the formal allocation process would produce if left to the assessor alone. And his analysis aligned with Marlowe's on the key points. They produced a joint position statement that both operations could submit, which would carry more weight than either submission alone. At the end of the meeting, Roy stood and extended his hand to Coulter, who shook it. Then he turned to Marlowe. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, the grip of a man completing a transaction, which was exactly what it was. You've built something real here, Mrs. Vance, he said. It came out with the slight stiffness of a statement he'd decided to make, and was making regardless of whether it came naturally. We have, she said. She was careful to say we. Us. The fall market that year ran through the forward contract with Kirsch, and also a supplementary sale of the remaining animals that the contract hadn't covered. The prices on the supplementary sale ran higher than the contracted rate, which meant they had left some money on the table by contracting, a fact that she noted, dispassionately, and filed in the category of information useful for future decisions, neither regretting the contract nor pretending the gap wasn't there. Total revenue for the year came in substantially above what she had projected at the start. Not dramatically above. Projections that turn out dramatically off in the favorable direction mean the projections were poor, and hers weren't poor. But the margin was solid, the debt was gone, the ranch had added 1 permanent hand and 40 productive acres, and a forward contract that gave next year a foundation before it started. She updated the ledger the night the last settlement cleared. She wrote the final numbers in her precise, even hand, balanced the columns, and closed the book. The payment schedule was still on the wall. She looked at it for a moment, then crossed to the wall and unpinned it. She folded it carefully and put it in the file drawer, in the back, behind the loan satisfaction documents. Not thrown away. Filed. It was part of the story of the place, and she didn't believe in discarding things just because they were finished. She put a new page on the wall in its place. Not a crisis schedule this time. A development plan, 3 seasons out, the further growth of the southeast section, an expansion of the breeding agreement with Dawson, a projected increase in herd size that the improved pasture capacity could now support. Coulter found her there, looking at the new page. That's different, he said. Yes, she said. He came and stood beside her and looked at the plan. He read it slowly, following the numbers, asking 2 questions that she answered, and then standing with it in the way he stood with things that mattered to him. Last year, he said, I was trying to figure out how not to lose this place. I know. Now I'm reading a 3-year expansion plan. Yes. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief exactly, in something more like the particular amazement of a man who has watched a thing he loves come back to life and still hasn't fully absorbed that it's real. How did you know it could be done? She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. I didn't know, she said. I thought it was possible. That's not the same thing. You acted like you knew. You have to sometimes. If you wait until you're certain, you wait too long. She looked at the plan on the wall. I looked at what was here and I calculated what it could become, and then I worked toward that. Some of it worked the way I planned, some of it worked differently. Some of it didn't work and had to be redone. Most people didn't come here to do what most people do, she said quietly. It wasn't boasting. It was just accurate. He put his arm around her shoulders, which was a thing he did sometimes now, simply without occasion, and she leaned into it slightly, which was a thing she had learned to let herself do. Outside, the Vance land ran out to the dark horizon in every direction, and the cattle were settled in the pastures that had been salvaged, and the ones that had been reclaimed, and the fences held their lines against the night. And the creek ran lower than anyone wanted, but higher than last year, which was the direction things needed to move. The ranch was not a recovered thing. It was a growing thing, which was different and harder to hold and better in every way that mattered. Marlowe looked at the plan on the wall and thought about what would have to happen to get from here to the next line on the page. Then she picked up her pencil, sat down at the desk, and started working on how to make it happen. 3 years after the auction that saved Vance Ranch, the 3-season development plan came off the wall. Marlowe didn't throw it away. She folded it the same way she'd folded the payment schedule, carefully, without ceremony, and filed it in the drawer behind everything else. Then she put a new page up. The new page was larger. It had to be because the operation it described was larger, and the numbers on it would have been unrecognizable to the woman who had sat in this same office in the first week of her marriage, staring at a wooden box full of unreconciled ledgers and a debt that felt like a ceiling pressing down. The western pasture was fully established and had been for 2 seasons. The southeast corner was producing. The herd had grown from 63 head to 140, a number she had reached deliberately and in stages, never pushing the land faster than it could absorb. The Dawson breeding agreement had been renewed twice and expanded once, and the Vance line had developed enough of its own consistency that Earl Dawson had, in a letter the previous spring, suggested they were approaching the point where they might consider establishing their own breeding stock rather than continuing to rely on his. She had read that letter several times. It meant something specific in the language of the cattle business. It meant that a man who knew quality recognized it in what she'd built, and she had let herself feel that for exactly as long as it deserved before she started figuring out what it would cost to act on it. Abner Kirsch had become their primary buyer on a standing annual contract. 2 other buyers had been added in the 2nd year. In the 3rd year, an operation from 2 states east had written to inquire about volume availability, having heard about the Vance line through the kind of word of mouth that travels slowly in the cattle business, but travels with weight when it arrives. Hardin County had noticed all of this. Hardin County could not help but notice Barchin. The association meeting in the spring of the 3rd year was the first one where Marlowe felt the shift completely. Not the tentative, partial shift of the 1st year, where a few members had quietly agreed with her while the room's center of gravity still pointed toward Roy Delacroix, but something more like an actual reorientation. She had not engineered it. It had happened the way most real things happen, through the accumulation of evidence over time. The county had watched Vance Ranch go from a failing operation on the edge of foreclosure to one of the most consistently performing mid-sized cattle operations in the region. They had watched it happen under the management of a woman they had spent a year telling jokes about. The jokes had not stopped entirely. That kind of thing never stops entirely. But they had lost their audience, which amounted to the same thing. Calloway, the older rancher from the north side, arrived at that spring meeting and sat beside Marlowe rather than across from her, which was a small thing and not a small thing. He asked her opinion on the proposed county road maintenance assessment before the meeting started, in the way you ask someone whose judgment you've decided to trust. She gave him her opinion. It was the same opinion she'd formed 3 weeks ago when she'd first seen the proposal and run the numbers on how the assessment would distribute across operations of different sizes. "That's what I thought," he said, "but I wanted to hear how you reasoned it." Roy Delacroix was present. He and Marlowe had reached a functional détente that neither of them would have called friendship, and both of them would have called useful. He no longer looked at her the way he had in the first year, with the barely contained impatience of a man dealing with an obstacle that hadn't removed itself on schedule. He looked at her the way one experienced operator looks at another, with the specific wariness of someone who has been educated by experience about the cost of underestimation. He had never apologized. She had never expected him to. What he had done in the 2 years since their meeting at the assessor's office was cooperate on the water allocation, refer 2 buyers to the Vance operation when his own volume was oversubscribed, and stay clearly on his own side of every boundary she had established. It was not redemption, it was recalibration, and she had been honest with herself about which one it was. At the end of that meeting, a younger rancher, a man named Price, who had started a small operation on the county's western edge 2 years prior and was struggling with the same early-stage problems every small operation struggled with, stopped her on the way out. "Mrs. Vance," he said. He was maybe 26, with the look of someone working very hard to appear more certain than he felt. I've read about the forward contract arrangement you use with your primary buyer. I was wondering if I could ask you some questions about how you structured it." She looked at him. He reminded her slightly of no one she could specifically name, which was probably why he reminded her of something more general, the specific anxiety of someone who has taken on more than they were sure they could handle and is trying to figure out how not to show it. "Come by the ranch next week," she said, "Tuesday afternoon. Bring your current buyer correspondence and your last 2 seasons of sale records." He blinked. "You'd look at my records?" "I'd look at your records and tell you what I see. After that, what you do with it is your business." She paused. "The county does better when all the operations do better. That's not generosity, it's arithmetic." He came on Tuesday with a folder of papers that were in approximately the same condition her files had been in the first week she'd arrived at Vance Ranch. She went through them at the kitchen table while Coulter sat at the far end reading through the new acreage proposal she was developing, and she told Price what she saw in the same flat, direct way she told anyone anything. He left 3 hours later with a list of specific things to address, a referral to the trade publications she'd found most useful, and the name of a buyer contact she thought might suit his volume and quality level. She did not charge him for any of it. She also did not make it warm and mentor-like, because that was not her nature, and pretending it was would have helped neither of them. Coulter looked up after Price's wagon had gone. "Word's going to get around that you'll do that." "I know," she said. "You might end up with a lot of young ranchers at your kitchen table." "I know that too." She picked up the acreage proposal. "I'll deal with it when it becomes a problem. Right now, it's just one person." Don't. The question of acreage came to a head in the 4th year. It came through a legal notice, a parcel adjacent to the Vance property's northern boundary, 40 acres that had been operated by an aging rancher named Cates, who had no children and no heir, and had finally made the decision to sell. The notice went out to interested parties through the county registrar, and Marlowe saw it the same day it was posted. She had been watching that parcel for 2 years, not with urgency and not with the predatory attention that characterized how Roy Delacroix had watched the Vance Eastern section before the auction, with the practical awareness of someone who understood what a particular piece of ground could do for an operation if the timing and the terms were right. The timing was right. The terms were a question. She rode out to see Cates herself. He was 73, living alone in a house that needed more work than he could give it, and he received her on his porch with the unhurried manner of someone who had simplified his needs down to the essentials. "I know why you're here," he said. "Then I'll skip the preamble," she said. "What do you need for it?" He named a price that was fair, not below market, not inflated. A man asking what the land was worth, not what he could get. She named a counter that was slightly below his number, not as an insult but as a negotiation, and gave him her reasoning for the difference, which related to the condition of the north fence line and the cost of the remediation work that would be required before the parcel was productive. He considered this and came back with a number between the two, and they shook hands on the porch in the early morning before the heat came. When she brought the terms back to Coulter, he looked at them and said, "The north fence line. It'll need to come out and be replaced entirely. That's real cost." She pointed to the line in her notes where she'd estimated it. "But the grass is good, better than our current north section, actually. Kate's kept it in decent shape, even when he was winding down. We can finance the purchase outright? With a small draw on the operating reserve, it leaves us thinner than I'd like for 6 months, but the pasture capacity it adds means we can move to 160 head by next spring without overloading the land, which is what the Kirsch contract for next year requires if we want to hold the volume commitment." He nodded slowly. He had gotten better, over 4 years, at following the chain from one decision to the next, seeing the way a fence line connected to a head count, connected to a contract commitment, connected to a cash position. It was not natural to him the way it was natural to her, but he'd learned it in the same patient way he'd learned other things she'd brought to the operation. "Do it," he said. The Cates parcel closed in September. 200 acres of Vance Ranch became 240. The north fence line came out and was replaced over 4 weeks by a crew that Garrett organized with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. And by the time the first colt arrived, the new pasture was incorporated into the rotation, and the herd had already begun to use it. Garrett walked the new fence with Marlowe on the last day of the work, checking the line from one end to the other. At the far northern corner, where the new fence met the old and the Vance land stretched back south as far as either of them could see, he stopped. "You remember what this place looked like when you came," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "It didn't look like this." "No," she said. "It didn't." He was quiet for a moment. Garrett was always quiet, but this had a different quality. The quiet of someone arriving at something he'd been approaching for a while. "I've worked this land for a long time," he said. "Worked it under Coulter's father. Worked it under Coulter. I didn't think it had this in it." She looked at the land. "The land always had it," she said. "It just needed someone to work it right." He gave her a long look, the specific look of a man deciding whether to say the next thing. Then he said it. "You're the best operator I've ever worked for. I thought you should know that." From Garrett Phelps, who had said she was recoverable land and meant it as a compliment, this was as complete a statement as the man was capable of making. She received it without deflecting and without making too much of it. "Thank you, Garrett," she said. They walked the rest of the fence line without speaking, which was exactly right. What nobody tells you about building something from the ground up is how ordinary most of it feels while you're doing it. Marlowe had thought about this in the way she thought about most things, directly, without romanticizing it. People would ask her, in later years, what it had been like to turn a failing ranch into a thriving operation, and the honest answer was that it had been a series of mornings that required getting up and doing the next specific thing, and then the morning after that, and then the one after that. There was no single moment where it shifted from one category to the other. There was just the accumulation of decisions made well enough often enough that the direction of travel was consistently forward. Some of those decisions had been wrong. She didn't hide this. The second rotation's breeding schedule had been too aggressive and produced a smaller calf crop than projected, and she had overcorrected on the water management in the third year's dry season in a way that cost them 6 weeks of optimal grazing. Small errors, correctable errors, but errors, not triumphs, and she thought it was important to account for them as clearly as the successes. What she had learned, in 4 years of working a piece of ground that everyone had decided was already dead, was something she hadn't expected to learn because she'd thought she already knew it, that the difference between a person who builds something and a person who doesn't is almost never talent and almost never luck, though both matter at the margins. The difference is the willingness to stay inside the difficulty long enough for the work to compound. Most people leave before it compounds. They leave when it's still just hard, before it's become anything else. And they tell themselves the thing wasn't possible when the real answer is that they didn't stay long enough to find out. She had stayed. Not because she was certain it would work, because she had decided that leaving was the only thing that guaranteed it wouldn't. The evening of the 4th anniversary of her arrival at Vance Ranch, Coulter found her on the porch after supper, looking out at the land in the last of the light. He brought 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her, which was where he sat most evenings now, in the comfortable and slightly worn way of 2 people who have inhabited the same space long enough that the space has shaped itself around them. 4 years, he said. Yes. You know what I was thinking about today? What? Denny Pruitt, he said. When you drove up that first day, that whistle he did. She almost smiled. I remember. He asked me last month if he could put in for a permanent hand position, said he's been here long enough and wanted something more stable. Coulter glanced at her. I told him to talk to you. He hasn't talked to me. He's working up to it. A pause. He's a little afraid of you. He should have thought of that before the whistle, she said. Coulter laughed. The real laugh, the one without any weight behind it, the one that had taken most of the first year to appear and was now a regular feature of the evenings. Are you going to hire him? She considered it. He's reliable. He works hard. He stopped making comments about things that aren't his business about 2 years ago. She picked up her coffee. Probably. They were quiet for a while. The cattle had settled for the night in the far pasture, and the land had gone to the long, flat blue of dusk, and the fence lines they could see from the porch held their straight, careful geometry against the fading light. What's next? Coulter asked. He meant it genuinely. Asked it the way he always asked it now, as a partner, asking another partner, not as a man asking someone he'd hired to solve a problem. She had been thinking about it. The answer when she gave it to him was not dramatic. It was specific. A targeted expansion of the breeding program, the development of a direct relationship with a processor in the Eastern market that would let them sell finished animals rather than just feeders, and the possibility, still in the tentative stage, still running the numbers, of a small parcel on the western boundary that had come available through a different kind of circumstance than the Cates land. He listened. He asked 2 questions. He said what he thought, which was sometimes the same as what she thought and sometimes not. And when it wasn't, they talked through it the way they had learned to talk through things, without one of them performing certainty they didn't have, without either of them needing to win. This was the thing she hadn't put in any ledger, because it didn't fit in a ledger, the specific value of a partnership where both people had learned to be honest about what they knew and what they didn't. It was harder to build than a cattle operation, and it had no measurement that she'd found. But she thought, in the objective way she thought about most things, that it was probably the most important thing she'd built in 4 years. The light went down, and the first stars came out over the land that was theirs, all 240 acres of it, and the coffee cooled in their cups while they sat on the porch and talked about what came next. In the county, the story of Marlo Vance had been revised and revised again over 4 years until what remained bore little resemblance to the joke that had circulated in the first weeks of her marriage. She knew this not because anyone told her directly. She was not the kind of person people told things to directly, but because the evidence accumulated in the ways that evidence does, in the way people spoke to her at the association meetings, in the letters that arrived asking for advice or referrals, or simply for her opinion on a county matter, in the way young Price had sat at her kitchen table and taken notes like he was being taught something worth knowing. She had not set out to change the county's mind about her. She had set out to make the ranch work. The change of mind was a byproduct of the work, not a goal of it, and that distinction mattered to her because she had seen what happened to people who confused the two, who did the work for the audience rather than for the result, and who ended up with an audience and no result. The result was here. It was in the ledger in the office, and the cattle in the pasture, and the fence lines running true across the dark land, and the plan on the wall that would carry them into the next 3 years. She would still be here in 3 years. She knew this the way she knew the things she had earned the right to be certain about. Not because the future was guaranteed, nothing was, and the drought could come back, and the prices could fall, and the work would always find new ways to be difficult, but because she had long since stopped measuring her commitment to this place by how hard it was. The hard was just part of it, the part before the part that mattered. She finished her coffee. The stars were fully out now, the particular density of them that you only saw from flat open country, and the land below them was quiet and large and genuinely hers. She picked up the cups and went inside, and Coulter held the door. and behind them the ranch settled into the night. Not perfect, not finished, not the end of anything, but alive in the way that things are alive when someone has decided to refuse every other outcome. That was enough. That had always been enough. It was more than enough now.